In the pristine, gated community of Abacoa, Florida, Timothy Ferriter's garage contained a secret that shattered the suburban illusion. Behind the standard overhead door stood an 8-by-8-foot windowless structure, a custom-built box of drywall and plywood. It wasn't a workshop or a storage unit. It was a cage. Inside, a 14-year-old boy was discarded for 18 hours a day, left with only a mattress and a bucket. The door didn't have a handle on the inside, only a deadbolt accessible from the garage floor. This was a dungeon in $1 million home. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Timothy Ferriter was a man who understood the architecture of success and the importance of maintaining its exterior. As a high-level executive in the technology and software industry, his professional life was a series of managed expectations and calculated results. Those who moved in his corporate circles saw a polished, capable leader, a man who had climbed the ladder to command six-figure salaries and the respect of his peers. His wife, Tracy, complemented this image perfectly. She was a stay-at-home mother who appeared deeply invested in the complex logistics of raising 4 children, navigating the demands of a high-status household with practiced ease. The family's journey to the palm-lined streets of Jupiter, Florida, began thousands of miles away in Arizona. For years, they lived in the desert suburbs, building a life that looked, from every angle, like the American dream realized. It was during these years that the Faraders decided to expand their family through adoption. In the early 2000s, they traveled to Vietnam to adopt a 1-year-old boy, the child who would eventually be known in court documents as RF. At the time, the act was framed as one of profound compassion, a wealthy American couple providing a future for an orphaned child from the other side of the world. However, the transition from the orphanage to the Ferriter household was not the seamless fairy tale the couple had anticipated. Almost immediately, Timothy and Tracy began to report significant behavioral issues with their new son. They described a child who was not just difficult, but fundamentally detached. Medical professionals eventually provided a diagnosis that would become the cornerstone of the Ferriters' future defense: reactive attachment disorder, or RAD. It is a condition often found in children who have experienced early childhood trauma or neglect, leaving them unable to form healthy emotional bonds with primary caregivers. In the Ferriter household, the diagnosis of RAD was treated not just as a medical reality, but as a looming threat. Timothy and Tracy claimed that as the boy grew into his teenage years, his behavior escalated from simple defiance to genuine danger. They told therapists and school officials about a son who stole, who lied with pathological conviction, and who allegedly exhibited violent tendencies toward his siblings. Timothy would later insist to investigators that they were living in a state of constant siege, fearful of what the boy might do if left to his own devices. Yet, as the years passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in how the parents addressed these challenges. In Arizona, the discipline was already beginning to look less like parenting and more like containment. The couple's other 3 biological children were raised in a world of privilege and freedom, while the adopted son was increasingly sidelined, his life dictated by a rigid set of rules that seemed to shrink his world with every passing month. In late 2021, Timothy accepted a new professional opportunity that required a move to Florida. They chose the Abacoa neighborhood in Jupiter, a community famous for its new urbanism design, where front porches and walking trails were meant to foster a sense of togetherness. They purchased a $1.1 million home on South Community Drive. It was a sprawling, beautiful property that promised a fresh start for the entire family. But the fresh start included a very specific construction project. Almost as soon as they moved in, Timothy began work in the garage. He didn't build a guest suite or a home gym. Instead, he utilized his professional skills in project management to oversee the installation of a small, windowless room. He told the contractors it was intended as a home office, or a quiet space, for his son's behavioral therapy. To the neighbors, the Faraders were just another successful family, unloading moving trucks and settling into the rhythms of Jupiter life. They saw Timothy jogging in the mornings and Tracy running errands. They saw a family that seemed to have everything under control, They had no way of knowing that inside the pristine white garage of that million-dollar home, a 14-year-old boy was being introduced to his new reality, a cell that measured exactly 8 feet by 8 feet. The why behind this construction was framed by Timothy as a desperate attempt to protect his family from a broken child. The how, however, would soon become the subject of a criminal investigation that would expose the dark rot beneath the Farader's polished suburban surface. The partnership between Timothy and Tracy Farader was not merely a marriage, it was a high-functioning logistical operation. They had met decades earlier, two ambitious individuals drawn together by a shared vision of an orderly, prosperous life. Their early years were defined by a relentless climb up the corporate and social ladders of the American West. Friends from their time in Arizona remembered a couple that seemed perfectly synchronized, rarely disagreeing in public and presenting a unified front that bordered on the impenetrable. They were a team that approached life's challenges with the clinical efficiency of a board meeting. When they decided to adopt RF, it was a project they undertook with the same calculated intensity they applied to Timothy's career. They didn't just want a child, they wanted to build a legacy of compassion that matched their financial success. But when the reality of raising a child with complex trauma began to chafe against their desire for a controlled environment, their relationship didn't fracture. Instead, it hardened. They closed ranks, and the boy was quickly redefined as a problem to be solved, an outlier in their otherwise perfect dataset. Their shared mindset was one of extreme isolation. Inside the walls of their home, Timothy and Tracy cultivated a dynamic where they were the primary victims of their son's existence. They spent hours behind closed doors, reinforcing each other's frustrations and validating a growing resentment. To the outside world, Tracy was the tirelessly devoted mother navigating the labyrinth of special education and behavioral therapy. To Timothy, she was the frontline commander reporting the boy's daily infractions. This feedback loop created a toxic domestic culture where the adopted son was increasingly viewed not as a family member, but as a hostile entity within the perimeter. The relationship between the parents and their biological children was equally complex. The three siblings were raised in an atmosphere of relative freedom, yet they were implicitly taught that their brother was different, that he was dangerous and required special measures. This created a profound psychological rift in the household. The biological children occupied the light of the family's public-facing life, while RF was being pushed into the shadows of the garage. Timothy and Tracy's complicity in this segregation was absolute. There was no room for dissent or empathy that might disrupt their established narrative of containment. As they moved into the house in Jupiter, the logistics of their parenting took a sinister architectural turn. Timothy, with his executive penchant for permanent solutions, viewed the garage as the only viable site for the office he intended to build. The planning was meticulous. He didn't just throw up a few sheets of drywall. He designed a space intended to endure. He and Tracy discussed the placement of the structure to ensure it was tucked away from the sightlines of anyone passing by the open garage door. They settled on a corner where the hum of the pool pump and the heavy, humid air of the Florida climate would provide a constant, droning backdrop. The construction phase was a period of quiet, shared purpose. Timothy oversaw the installation of the plywood floor and the ceiling, ensuring the space was entirely enclosed. The sensory details of this period are chilling. The sharp, chemical scent of fresh drywall mud, the rhythmic thud of a nail gun, and the sight of Timothy installing a camera in the corner of the ceiling. It wasn't just a room, it was a monitored environment. Tracy was present for the decisions regarding the furnishings, a single mattress on the floor and a plastic bucket. They didn't buy a desk or a bookshelf for this office. They were building a space that offered nothing but the barest requirements for biological survival. The most telling detail of their relationship was the lock. Timothy installed a deadbolt on the exterior of the door. It was a clear, mechanical statement of their shared philosophy. The boy had no agency, no way to exit, and no voice that could penetrate the thick layers of drywall. They had created a world where the only interaction the boy had with his parents was through a lens or a locked door. The relationship was no longer one of guidance or love. It had become one of jailer and inmate. Even as the box was completed, the Faraders continued to participate in the social rituals of Abacoa. They hosted small gatherings and maintained their standing in the community, all while the 14-year-old was locked just a few feet away from their luxury SUVs. They relied on a shared silence, a mutual agreement that the horror in the garage was a medical necessity that no one else needed to understand. This wasn't a case of one parent hiding abuse from the other. This was a joint venture in cruelty, sustained by a couple who believed their wealth and their diagnosis of the child gave them the right to play the roles of judge, jury, and warden in their own home. Their partnership had evolved into a fortress, designed to keep the boy in and the truth out. The climate of Jupiter in January is deceptively pleasant, 75 degrees with a soft breeze coming off the Atlantic. But inside the garage on South Community Drive, the air remained stagnant and heavy. By the morning of January 28, 2022, the 14-year-old boy's reality had been reduced to a sequence of mechanical sounds. The most significant was the metallic clack of the deadbolt. This sound governed his entire existence. It was the only signal that the world outside his 8x8-foot enclosure was acknowledging his presence. For months, the boy's routine had been a study in extreme isolation, a protocol designed by Timothy Ferriter with executive precision. The boy would be released from the box only for school and the briefest of intervals for hygiene. His meals were not shared at the family table in the dining room just a few yards away. Instead, they were handed through the door. Often, he was forced to eat alone in the dim light of a single bulb, which was controlled by a switch on the outside of the structure. If Timothy or Tracy decided he had been defiant, the light stayed off. He would sit in total darkness, the only sound being the distant hum of the family's luxury cars or the muffled laughter of his siblings in the main house. The interior of the box was a sensory desert. There were no windows, no books, no toys, no items that suggested a child lived there. The walls were bare drywall, the floor a cold slab of plywood. In the corner sat a single mattress and a blue plastic bucket. This bucket served as his toilet. Because he was locked in for up to 18 hours a day, he had no access to the home's bathrooms. The smell of waste and stale air became a permanent fixture of his environment, a psychological weight intended to remind him of his otherness within the family unit. Timothy had installed a ring camera in the upper corner of the ceiling, a digital eye that allowed the parents to monitor the boy's every movement from their smartphones. This was not for safety, but for total surveillance. Later, investigators would recover over 1,700 hours of footage from this camera, a digital archive of suburban torture. The videos captured a disturbing power dynamic. Timothy was seen entering the box not to comfort, but to dominate. On multiple occasions, the footage showed Timothy pinning the boy against the plywood floor, his weight used to suppress a child who was significantly smaller and undernourished. The father's movements were clinical, his face often a mask of frustration as he lectured the boy about his Vietnam origins and his supposed lack of gratitude. Tracy's presence on the footage was equally chilling. She was seen standing in the doorway, her voice sharp as she listed the boy's failures. The psychological pressure was constant. They told him he was broken, that his brain didn't work like other people's, and that the cage was the only place he belonged. The why behind this treatment was always framed by the Faraters as a defensive measure against Arad, yet the footage showed no signs of a dangerous child, only a boy who spent hours staring at the walls or curled in a fetal position on a bare mattress. The morning of January 28th began like any other. The deadbolt retracted. The boy was permitted to leave the garage and prepare for school. He attended Independence Middle School, a short distance from the Abacoa neighborhood. For the boy, school was not a place of academic stress, but a temporary sanctuary where the doors didn't lock from the outside. However, the psychological damage of the garage was beginning to manifest as a desperate, quiet resolve. He knew that when the final bell rang, the cycle of the clack and the bucket would resume. He didn't wait for the bell. Shortly after arriving on campus, the boy made a decision. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't act out. He simply walked. He slipped past the school's perimeter and disappeared into the sprawling palm-lined streets of Jupiter. He had no money, no phone, and no plan. Only the singular driving need to be anywhere, except the 8x8 box on South Community Drive. When the school notified the Faraders that their son was missing, the carefully constructed mask of the perfect family began to crack. Timothy and Tracy didn't just call the police. They embarked on a frantic private search. They drove their SUVs through the neighborhood, their eyes scanning the walking trails and parks. This wasn't the panic of parents worried about a child's safety in the Florida sun. It was the terror of two people who realized their prisoner had escaped, taking the secrets of the garage with him. By the afternoon, the Ferriters realized they could no longer keep the disappearance internal. They had to act the part of the grieving parents. They contacted the Jupiter Police Department to report RF as a runaway. Timothy, ever the executive, provided the responding officers with a polished narrative. He described a son with severe behavioral issues who had likely fled in a fit of Rady-induced rebellion. He played the role of the frustrated but devoted father to perfection, never mentioning the custom-built structure in the garage or the blue bucket. He didn't realize that by inviting the police into his life to find his runaway son, he was inviting them to look past the front porch. The investigation into a missing child was about to collide with the physical reality of the Faraders' home office. The boy was out in the world, wandering the streets of Jupiter, carrying the psychological scars of 1,000 nights in the dark. Timothy and Tracy remained in the house, waiting for the police to bring him back, unaware that the digital eye in the garage ceiling had already recorded everything necessary to destroy them. The incident wasn't just the escape. It was the moment the Faraders' arrogance led them to believe they could use the law to maintain their control. They assumed the police would see the Vietnam-born child the same way they did, as a problem to be returned to its box. They were wrong. The boy's absence was the first crack in the drywall, and the light from the outside was finally starting to leak in. The official record of the disappearance began not as a criminal investigation into child abuse, but as a standard response to a runaway juvenile. When the Jupiter Police Department dispatched officers to the South Community Drive residence, the atmosphere was one of professional urgency, the kind of response expected in a neighborhood where the median home price hovered well above 7 figures. The responding officers initially viewed the Faraders as the victims of a troubled child. They found Timothy and Tracy in a state of controlled agitation, presenting themselves as parents who had reached the end of their patience after years of dealing with a son they described as pathologically defiant. Timothy directed the officers' attention to the boy's history, explaining that his son suffered from disorders that made him prone to impulsive, dangerous behavior. He suggested that the 14-year-old had likely fled to find a way back to his roots, or simply to cause his parents further distress. This narrative was delivered with the polished conviction of a man used to giving presentations in high-stakes environments. The police began the process of gathering the necessary information for a BOLO, a Be on the Lookout alert. They asked for recent photographs, a description of the boy's clothing, and a list of locations where he might seek refuge. However, the protocol for a missing child often involves a cursory search of the home to ensure the child isn't hiding on the premises or to look for clues in their personal belongings, journals, electronics, or signs of planned flight. It was during this routine walkthrough that the polished facade of the Farader household began to disintegrate. The officers moved through the expansive, sun-drenched rooms of the main house. They saw the bedrooms of the biological children, spaces filled with the clutter of normal adolescence, sports equipment, high-end electronics, and posters. But when they asked to see the missing boy's room, the energy in the house shifted. There was a palpable hesitation from Timothy and Tracy. They eventually led the officers toward the garage. As the heavy door from the kitchen retracted, the officers were met with the standard sights of an Abacoa garage: high-end vehicles and organized storage. But in the corner, standing like a stark architectural anomaly, was the 8x8-foot structure. It looked like a temporary office or a large storage shed built directly into the floor. The detective on the scene noticed a few things immediately that didn't align with the home office description Timothy had provided. First, the smell, a sharp, unmistakable odor of human waste and stagnant air that the Florida humidity only served to amplify. Second, the door. The detective noted that the door to this structure was equipped with a deadbolt, but the lock was on the outside. There was no handle, no latch, and no way for anyone inside to exit without the assistance of someone in the garage. When Timothy was asked about the purpose of this room, he maintained his clinical tone. He explained that it was a therapeutic space, a necessary tool for managing his son's outbursts and ensuring the safety of the other children. He claimed the boy preferred it there because it provided a sensory-neutral environment. The officers requested to see the interior. Timothy produced a key and turned the deadbolt. The sound, that sharp metallic clack, echoed in the quiet garage. Inside, the officers found a scene that bore no resemblance to a bedroom or an office. They saw the single mattress on the floor, the bare plywood, and the blue plastic bucket. They saw the Ring camera mounted in the corner, its lens pointed directly at the mattress. There were no windows, no vent for air circulation, and no light that could be operated from within. The search for the boy intensified, but its nature had fundamentally changed. While patrol cars circled the area around Independence Middle School and the walking trails of Abacoa, the detectives at the house began to look at Timothy and Tracy with a new professional detachment. They were no longer just looking for a runaway. They were documenting a crime scene. Outside, the Jupiter sun beat down on the pavement as officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they had seen the 14-year-old. The community's reaction was a mixture of confusion and growing horror. Neighbors who had seen Timothy jogging or Tracy at the local shops struggled to reconcile the couple they knew with the police tape now cordoning off the garage. Rumors began to ripple through the gated community, whispers of a dungeon, of a boy kept in a box, of a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for months. The quiet, orderly atmosphere of Abacoa was replaced by the low hum of idling patrol cars and the intrusive glare of local news vans. Meanwhile, RF was still missing. He had been seen on school surveillance footage walking calmly toward the edge of the property, but after that, the trail went cold. The police feared that a boy who had spent the majority of his life in a windowless cell might not have the survival skills to navigate the world, or worse, that he had no intention of being found. As the sun began to set on that first day, the detectives focused on the digital evidence. They realized that the Ring camera in the garage wasn't just for live monitoring, it was recording. The search for the boy became secondary to the search for the truth contained within those servers. Timothy Ferriter stood in his driveway, still playing the role of the concerned father, unaware that the very technology he had installed to maintain his control was now systematically recording the evidence that would lead to his arrest. The search was no longer just about finding a child. It was about uncovering the full extent of the cruelty that had been designed, built, and maintained behind a deadbolt on South Community Drive. The shift from a search for a missing juvenile to a criminal inquiry happened the moment a detective's eyes adjusted to the dim light of that windowless structure. The physical evidence was undeniable, but the digital evidence would prove to be the Faraders' ultimate undoing. When the Jupiter Police Department seized the family's electronics, they didn't just find standard household data. They discovered a server containing the automated history of a prison. The Ring camera mounted in the corner of the garage cell had been active for months. Technicians began the grueling process of reviewing over 1,700 hours of footage, a digital ledger of every minute the boy spent behind that exterior deadbolt. The images were not of a child being treated for a disorder, but of a human being systematically erased. The detectives watched as the boy spent hours sitting on the plywood floor, his back against the drywall, staring at the door. There were no books, no electronics, no interaction. He existed in a state of sensory deprivation that mirrored solitary confinement in a maximum security penitentiary. The footage from early January 2022 was particularly damning. It showed Timothy entering the enclosure, not as a father, but as an enforcer. On multiple occasions, the camera captured him physically manhandling the 14-year-old, pinning him to the floor with the full weight of his adult frame. The boy's body appeared skeletal in the high-contrast night vision of the camera, his ribs visible, his movements sluggish. Timothy was seen shouting inches from the boy's face, his body language radiating a cold, clinical fury. He would then exit, the frame shaking as the door slammed shut, followed by the unmistakable metallic clack of the deadbolt. While the digital team processed the video, the lead investigators conducted separate interviews with the parents. Timothy's demeanor in the interrogation room was a study in corporate arrogance. He didn't deny the existence of the box. Instead, he attempted to frame it as a necessary architectural solution to a medical crisis. He lectured the detectives on the complexities of reactive attachment disorder, suggesting that they couldn't possibly understand the war zone he and Tracy lived in. He claimed the boy was a danger to the biological children, a thief, and a liar who required constant surveillance for his own protection. He spoke of the 8x8 space as a safe room, a term that felt increasingly grotesque as the evidence piled up. Tracy's interview offered a different perspective on the same cruelty. She presented as a woman who had fully internalized Timothy's narrative of victimhood. She described the boy's behavior in exhaustive detail, citing instances of him stealing food from the pantry or acting out by refusing to use the bucket in the garage. She seemed more concerned with the disruption the boy caused to their suburban lifestyle than the psychological toll of his confinement. When asked why the door locked from the outside, she simply stated that it was the only way to ensure he didn't roam the house at night. As the interviews concluded, the forensic medical team provided the results of the boy's physical examination. The 14-year-old, born in Vietnam, was found to be severely undernourished and suffering from stunted growth, a physical manifestation of the years of neglect. His psychological state was one of profound, learned helplessness. When he finally spoke to detectives in a safe house, he didn't lead with stories of physical pain. He spoke of the silence. He described the hours spent in the total darkness when his parents decided he hadn't earned the right to the light bulb. He talked about the bucket, the smell, and the feeling of the plywood against his skin. He stated that he had walked away from school that day not because of a specific argument, but because he had finally realized that the world outside the garage was larger than the world inside. The red herring that Timothy had carefully cultivated, the idea that the boy was a violent predator, was systematically dismantled by the very footage Timothy had recorded. The 1,700 hours showed no instances of the boy acting out violently against his parents or siblings. Instead, it showed a child who was almost entirely passive, a boy who had been conditioned to wait for the door to open. The investigation revealed that the biological children in the house were living a life of absolute contrast. They had access to the pool, the high-end gaming systems, and the shared family meals, all while their brother was kept in a space that local building inspectors later classified as uninhabitable for any purpose, let alone human residence. Detectives also uncovered a paper trail that showed Timothy had consulted with construction professionals about making the room soundproof. He had looked into high-grade insulation not for the comfort of the occupant, but to ensure that any cries for help or sounds of distress would never reach the ears of the neighbors or the other children in the house. This was premeditated containment. The executive had applied his project management skills to the logistics of child abuse, ensuring that every variable was controlled and every risk of exposure was minimized. The social echo in Abacoa was deafening. As the details of the investigation leaked to the local press, the new urbanism of the neighborhood felt suddenly sinister. People who had waved to Timothy on his morning runs or seen the Farader's SUVs at the local clubhouse were forced to confront the reality that they had lived within earshot of a dungeon. Rumors circulated about the box in the garage, and the house on South Community Drive became a local landmark of horror. The community's sense of safety was shattered, not by an outside intruder, but by the realization that the most polished family on the block was capable of the most primitive cruelty. By the time the state attorney's office reviewed the evidence, the charge was clear: aggravated child abuse. This wasn't a case of parenting at one's wit's end, as the defense would later argue. It was a case of a custom-built infrastructure of torture. The detectives had documented the construction, the surveillance, and the resulting physical and mental decay of the victim. The server that Timothy had installed to watch his son had become the primary witness for the prosecution. The 1,700 hours of video stood as a silent, digital testament to the fact that in a $1 million home in Jupiter, Florida, a child's life had been reduced to an 8x8-foot square of plywood and drywall. The investigation was no longer just a collection of facts. It was a comprehensive reconstruction of a suburban nightmare. The why was Timothy's need for absolute control. The how was the exterior deadbolt and the ring camera. As the case moved toward the courtroom, the boy remained in protective custody, finally living in a room where the handle was on the inside of the door. The legal reckoning in Palm Beach County became a referendum on the limits of parental authority and the definition of suburban discipline. In October 2023, Timothy Ferriter sat in a wood-paneled courtroom, his executive poise replaced by the heavy silence of a man facing the consequences of his own surveillance logs. The prosecution's case was anchored by the very drywall and digital data Timothy had curated, 1,700 hours of video that the jury watched with visible discomfort. The defense's attempt to frame the 8 by 8 foot cell as a desperate medical necessity for a broken child was dismantled by the clinical reality of the footage. The jury took only a few hours to return a verdict of guilty on all counts: aggravated child abuse, false imprisonment, and child neglect. The emotional pivot of the proceedings arrived during the victim's impact statement. The boy, no longer a prisoner of the garage, told the court through indirect testimony that his parents had treated him worse than a family pet, and that he had spent years wondering why he wasn't worthy of a handle on his door. Timothy remained stone-faced as the judge delivered a sentence of 5 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The man who had designed a cage for his son was finally ushered through a door he could not open from the inside. The $1 million home on South Community Drive has new owners, yet the garage cage remains a permanent scar on the local memory. The boy, now building a life far from the reach of Jupiter's gated communities, has finally unlearned the protocols of the box. He lives in a world where doors have handles on both sides, where his identity is no longer a diagnosis to be managed. Timothy Ferriter remains in prison, a corporate executive stripped of his rank, his freedom, and his legacy. His own 1,700 hours of digital surveillance remain as a final testament, proving that while you can build a cage, you can never truly lock away the human spirit. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.